comes for another keynote speaker. I told you I'm a journalist, and I wrote a lead very recently for a story introducing our keynote speaker at the conference, but I really wanted this person to be introduced to the world. And in this lead I wrote, no matter when you send a message to Ashish, the best way is to contact him is to use WhatsApp because you never know where he is. So no matter when you send a message to him, he's either in Rwanda and it's a Wednesday, on Friday he's already in Brazil, and on Sunday he's already in Myanmar. He's not a coffee grower, but he definitely does fur trade. He's highly experienced in social enterprise and extreme poverty and conflict zones. He's a CEO and founder of BanQ. And when we talked, when I was writing a story about him, he said to me that in India, when he was growing up in India, he didn't really think that the education may empower him, but he thought, if you want to have a better life, you gotta go. It is my real pleasure to introduce Ashish Gadnis, CEO of BanQ.
I need to stand here, right? I hate standing behind the podium. Can everybody hear me? If you can hear me, I don't. That's
Say whatever is
yeah,
better for you.
cool. Great, thanks. So I have like 25 minutes or something? Yeah, just give me a minute, that's 5, okay? So we'll make it interactive, right? So I don't do slides or anything like that. I'll just make it a conversation. So thank you for saying this is a conversation. So my name is Ashish. I run a software company called BanQ. If you disagree with me with anything, just raise your hand, push back. I don't have all the answers. I'm not an expert or anything like that. So we'll just have a conversation. So I have ADHD, so just up front here. I'm not very linear in my thinking, and I've had a lot of coffee today. So if it makes no sense, hopefully it'll all add up together at the end. So I generally like to just tell things from my personal experience, so it's just easier so that I don't have to practice. So I grew up poor in India. So if you've ever been to India, and I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s, I grew up in a slum. Don't have pity on me, I wear nice shoes and everything now, so it's all good. But one of the interesting things about growing up in a slum in India was that we had a ration card. And if you've ever been to India in a slum in Mumbai, the ration card in those days is kind of your lifeline to rice, wheat, and oil. And so every other day, my brother had the odd days, I had the even days, we had to stand in the ration line for 2 to 3 hours just to get food for our family. And I absolutely hated it, right? Because it's a pretty demeaning experience because your entire existence is tied to this ration card, right? And 14, 15 years into your lifetime, you kind of realize that you're a nobody, right? And your entire existence is tied to that ration card. If you lose the ration card, your dad's just gonna whack you, right? So it's just, so kind of growing up, I hated that. I hated being poor. And what was interesting about that is we did not have any sort of a history, right? In the sense that we didn't have a bank account. And at the end of the day, we're always at the mercy of an aid agency or, the ration. Everything was subsidized, right? But I was very, very lucky, right? And again, first of all, very lucky to be here. Tony and Monica and Paulina, just super blessed to be here. Thank you for the opportunity, for giving me this chance. And I was very lucky and blessed. So I was able to learn how to program. If you grew up in India in the 70s, you'd realize that you could either beg or you could code. So I started to code, which is why most Indians are coders. I was lucky, I got a job, I actually got to go to college, I got a job at Tata, and I left India in 1992, and I went to Colombia. They sent me to Latin America for 2 years. And it kind of completely changed my perspective. So I lived in Latin America for 2 years, and then I came to the US in 1994. It started making sense. I just wanted to give you this background because it has relevance to this conference and the work I do today. So in 1994, I came for the first time to America with $240. I had a job, so if anybody's listening, you never know, right, these days. I came legally, so at the end of my first month of working, my boss, I was working for a mutual fund company, I was a software programmer, and he said, if you really want to have any future in this country, you need to have a bank account. And for me, it was like the first time somebody had valued who I was, right? And I'm like, well, how am I going to get a bank account? He said, well, take my business card, take your rent receipt, take your pay stub, and take your utility bill, staple those 4 pieces of paper together, walk down outside of South Station in Boston, if you're from Boston, and there's this Fleet Street Bank, they'll let you open a bank account because they'll recognize these 4 pieces of paper and my business card. And so I did that. It was shocking that I had a bank account in like less than 30 minutes. Okay, so this is 1994, $240, and here I had suddenly become legit. I was recognized in the world, and I had arrived, right? So just kind of hold that for a second, because we'll come back to 1994 in a second. And what was fascinating about that experience for me was that I suddenly went from 24 years of life of non-existence being a number, right, in a ration card, and now suddenly had a bank account, right? I was legit because I was recognized. Somebody had given me an identity that could prove my work history, an identity that could prove my legitimacy because I had a utility bill, right? I had a phone receipt, I had a business card. So from there, kind of my journey started, where I just started working, and I built and sold a couple of startups. It was extremely, it's like 99.9% luck, and then God just keeps giving you. And so I built and sold 3 startups. My most successful startup was in 2012 that I sold, and I retired at the end of 2012. And I always wanted to do something in poverty, but I didn't want to just keep cutting the classic aid check, right? And so I decided I wanted to do something different, so I became a volunteer CEO for USAID. And I spent 2 years in DRC. DRC is the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I decided that I wanted to start a social enterprise because the USAID was looking for some innovative ideas from business guys like me who didn't have anything else going on. So I spent 2 years running a social enterprise. You can look it up. It's called Asili, A-S-I-L-I. I don't work at Asili anymore. I'll tell you what I do right now because it'll start adding up pretty quickly here. So I spent 2 years running a classic social enterprise funded by USAID and partly by businesses like me from a past life. And we started running a social enterprise program that was connecting basic things like health, water, sanitation, and food for migrants and refugees on the Congo-Rwanda border, right? So when you mention IDPs, if you've ever been to Congo, it's one of the longest running conflict zones, probably very similar to Iraq. And these are Congolese refugees, they're refugees from the Rwandan genocide. And the horrors that I saw completely broke my heart because I thought I was poor in India, right? And then I realized, oh my God, I'm actually like upper middle class compared to these people, right? So everything's relative. And what happened is at the end of 2014, we were getting a lot of awards. We were getting recognized by the Battery Ventures Award, the Human Centered Design Award, and this and that. You can look up all this. You can do your own homework. But I got into a fight at the end of 2014. Not a great place to get into a fight in Congo, but here I am. And the fight was very fundamental, which is kind of ties all of this together in a second here. So one of the mothers that I've been working with for 2 years, she was an IDP, internally displaced Congolese refugee who had been, had lost a lot of family members, her children had been killed. I mean, if you're in that part of the world, rape is a weapon. So you're talking about some of the most horrific things that are happening in the world happen in Congo, and I happened to be there for 2 years. And but she had made a little bit of money on a harvest, like a cacao, cassava harvest, and she wanted to open a bank account. So I gotten to know her, and she said, "Hey, I want to open a bank account." And I thought that was very, very smart because in a weird way, 20 years ago, I had almost the same experience, right, where somebody was telling me to go open a bank account. And so I went with her to this local bank, but the local bank refused to let her open a bank account. And it really bothered me because, women are smarter than men, we all agree, right? If you don't agree, please leave. No, I'm just kidding. But it was fascinating, right? This woman was extremely smart. She had already thought through this. She had been in 50 years of conflict, right? Of disaster, and she realized that if I open a bank account, I'll have the legitimacy, right? But the local bank said no. So we got into a fight, which basically kind of got violent, and the guy said, "Look, I can't bank her, but I'll bank you." So that's where the name comes from. So I run a company today called BankQ, and I'll make the connections here in a second. So what was interesting about that fight in 2014, that even though I was running a social enterprise, part of USAID, one of the largest aid organizations in the world, at the end of the day, the mother did not exist. Think about that for a second. The mother had Harvest, the mother had multiple United Nations identity cards, she was in a Doctor Without Border program, but she did not exist. She couldn't prove her legitimacy in that supply chain, right? In fact, she was actually enrolled in an education program, right, from Gates Foundation or somebody, right, for like basic literacy campaign and things like that. And it kind of bothered me because I kind of realized that at the end of the day, 20 years before that, in 1994, my education, my paperwork was acceptable, but here I am 20 years later, this mother doesn't exist in the world supply chain. And I kind of realized that I had made the same mistake that every other entrepreneur makes, right? We get up one morning, sell our companies, and think we can make a difference in the world, and we're totally wrong about it. So I took a step back, and I took a year, and I started traveling. And so I spent a lot of time in the Dadaab refugee camp. Started going to the Zatri refugee camp on the Jordan-Syrian border. Went to Myanmar with the Rohingya refugees. And there was an interesting thread in all of these examples, which was refugees particularly. So right now, it's 17 years is the average time a refugee will spend in a refugee camp, right? That's the number that's published by the UN. I think it's a lot higher, but let's go with 17 years. And here's what I found in Dadaab. And the reason why I spent a lot of time in Dadaab is if you look up my company, my co-founder is Hamse Warfa. He was a refugee himself. His family was killed in Mogadishu. He spent 3.5 years in Dadaab. So we went back in 2015 to see what's really going on. And that's kind of when I realized that refugees or migrant workers, right, do get a lot of education, do get a lot of, and it doesn't, education is all different stratas, right? So you could get technical education. In fact, if you go to the Dadaab refugee camp, there's an HTML programming class camp inside of the Dadaab refugee camp. If you're not in computers, HTML allows you to build websites, right? And so think about that for a second. So we started interacting with these refugee kids and young men and women. We asked them, you have these things that happen to you in a refugee camp, right? So you're participating in a loan program like a microfinance, so you're getting a refugee education program from World Refugee School or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, what's the difference? And the single thing that they said to us was that we still don't exist if we leave the camp. I can't go back to Mogadishu and say, hey, I was taught HTML programming in Dadaab, right? I'm going to throw out a couple other examples and we'll make it, and then we'll talk about solutions, right? Now, come back to the United States, in the city of Austin, Texas, where I live, where we just started to roll out with the homeless. If you're a homeless person in a city in the United States today, your status is no different from a migrant. You're reset. So you can't prove your education. So if I'm a homeless person and I have a bachelor's in art from Austin Community College, and I walk into a job application and I cannot prove my paperwork, my education's worthless, right? Feel free to push back. I'm just trying to just plant some seeds of actual real life scenarios where your education, your work, your information, if it is not part of your identity, you don't exist, right? Take a simple example. If I told Tony, walk outside and go to the car dealership, and the only thing you can bring with you is your driver's license, but you can't tell them where you work, you can't tell them your education, you can't tell them your income, you can't show them their pay stub. Try to get a car loan and just tell them you're Tony. What's Tony's experience going to be? Pretty bad, right? And so now think about the same experience that a refugee or a migrant worker goes through who cannot prove their education, who cannot prove the legitimacy of their education. I'll give you a live example. So we start, and I'll tell you what I do in a second, but I just want to kind of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of the problem that needs to be solved, right? Because we're here to make the world a better place. So Costa Rica is a good example. We just started to roll out with IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank. So in Costa Rica right now, there's a lot of migrant youth, right, that are from Nicaragua, Venezuela because of the crisis. What's happening in places like Costa Rica is that if you're a migrant worker there, you get discriminated because you can't prove your education. You get discriminated. In fact, I've interacted with youth who actually are forced to take half an hour lunch break because they're migrant workers instead of the 1 hour lunch break that they're owed, right? So think about that for a second, because they cannot prove their existence because none of their paperwork matters, right? Because they can't prove who they are. So that's the problem, right? So how do we solve it? So I run a company that is built on blockchain. So before you start running and start cashing out or anything like that, we have nothing to do with cryptocurrency. Now, it doesn't matter what you do. If you're a Jesuit from Malta, you know about cryptocurrency. And Renee knows it. I'm picking on him because we've had this conversation. But a lot of people talk about blockchain and cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth. So I'm not here to talk to you about cryptocurrencies. I'm here to talk about the value of technology when it comes to refugees and migrant workers. Because technologies like blockchain, right, if you leave the cryptocurrency mania aside and Bitcoin, the real value is it allows refugees and migrant workers to have an identity. And when I say identity, let's kind of go a little bit deeper here, right? Everybody has an identity, right? You have 4 identities. Refugees actually have more identities because they have 4 different UN agencies giving them, if you look at what's going on with the Rohingya right now, they have 4 different identity cards. But at the end of the day, they don't exist because they exist as a number in the database of an aid agency. Nothing wrong, right? The aid is important, don't get me wrong. But what's missing in this equation is that the refugee has no ability, and this is critical, if you didn't hear any of this last part is key. The refugee or the migrant worker does not have the ability to own, access, monetize, and permission their own data. Think about that well, we don't either, right? We in the first world don't either, but if you're a refugee, or if you're a migrant worker, or you're forced displaced, IDP, you cannot own your data today, right? Feel free to say no. Think about the refugees who are in Zaatari today that then get moved to Berlin. They start all over again. In Berlin, they might get a packet that will give them some information about their aid, their education, but if they go from Berlin to London, if the paper is lost, you start from zero, right? It's just a very basic flaw in the model of the world we live in, because if you're forced into migration, if you're displaced, if you're a refugee, and you cannot prove your history, then you're starting from zero, right? It's just like what happened to the mother in Congo, because if she could improve her existence in the supply chain, she was not bankable, right? So that's what we decided we were going to solve back in, when I started seeing this problem in 2014 and 15. And so in 2016, me and a couple of my partners, we started this platform called BankQ. It's BankQ, you could look it up. We're a for-profit software company. So just putting that out there up front. And our model is pretty straightforward. What we have figured out that if you look at the 2.5 billion people in the world who live in extreme poverty, and the 67 million refugees that are part of that because they're completely displaced, they do not have an economic identity. When we say economic identity, what we mean by that is that an identity that proves their existence in the work they do, that proves their existence in the supply chains they operate. So think about this for a second, right? Let's look at an example. If you're wearing these pair of jeans right now, there's a good chance if they're an Abercrombie pair of jeans or something like that, that says they were made in the Dominican Republic, and this is a live example, there's a good chance that they were made by 14,000 Haitian migrant slave workers who make them and get paid $1.50 a day, right? Push back if this is not adding up. Yet, you pay 80 bucks at a Macy's, and these migrant workers, every morning at 4:30, cross over from Guanamete into Dajabon, between the Haitian and the Dominican Republic border, get treated very poorly, make $1.50 a day, live below the poverty line, and go back, right? So what's the flaw in that model? For a refugee or a migrant worker, none of the work they do or the education they get is certified, is to a point where they can leverage it, correct? If you can't prove who you are, how are you going to get out of the situation that you're in? Am I making sense? Pauline, are you going to kick me out, or are we doing good so far? Okay. Is this making sense? Okay. So how do you solve this, right? And this is where technology is not the answer, trust me, right? I've been in technology 30 years. Technology is not the answer, right? Technology is an enabler, right? So one of the things that we started looking at was this technology called blockchain, right? Like you can't turn around and not hear blockchain, right? You might have been living in a hole if you didn't hear about Bitcoin or blockchain, right? But I'm going to make it very simple, right? Because one of the things, I'm a big believer, right? If you never see me again, at least I would have provoked your thinking to do something different because the world's changing really fast. And we're getting further and further divided as a human race, right? But there are opportunities to change that. There are opportunities to turn the curve and say we can do better, right? So I'll give you a very simple example of how we use technology when it comes to refugees and migrant workers. And I'll give you two live examples. One with education certification in Costa Rica. Second is education and basic vocational training certification for the Somali refugees in Kenya. And then we'll talk about one more example about the Syrian refugee mothers that we're rolling out on the Jordan-Syrian border. So live examples, right? But let's just take a step back and figure out what is this thing that I keep talking about, blockchain, right? So we'll make it simple, which is from a refugee standpoint. So let's take an example. If I sell a cup of coffee to Tony right now, okay? I have Tony's data, correct? He'll give me a credit card, I'll swipe it, I have all this information. Tony has no rights to his data in the normal world we live in, right? So if he took a plane, went to London, he couldn't prove that I sold him a cup of coffee. That's just a fact, because I own his data, right? Now Tony could have a paper receipt or something like that, because we live in the first world. But this is a critical example, right? Which means in this simple transaction where I just sold him a cup of coffee, he bought a cup of coffee, I have his data, I have his credit card, heck, I could hack into his phone, I could get more of his information, right? Now let's just change roles and make Tony a refugee, correct? Who was in a refugee camp that just got through a vocational training program, right? Say basket weaving or whatever, right? English lessons, right? In the Zatri camp that was conducted by an aid agency. Okay? So I've just trained him on a certain vocational training program, right? I get his data, I report it to the foundation that's funding me, and Tony gets a piece of paper, correct? He might have a mobile phone, most of them have. What happens now, in that live example? I start maintaining a lot of data on Tony, correct? If Tony has to move from one refugee camp to another, or if Tony came into the US as a refugee and he's going from one aid agency to another, if Tony doesn't start maintaining this file folder, he doesn't have much chance to prove his existence. And if he loses his file folder, he's out of luck, right? And this is the reason because he's out of luck is there's a flaw in the existing systems in the world. And the flaw is very basic, which is it's a one-sided system, right? Everything in the world is one-sided. If I do something with Monica, I have Monica's data, Monica doesn't have data. So it gets worse if you're displaced, right? If that mother in Congo was forced to move from Congo to Rwanda, she couldn't prove she was a USA farmer. She couldn't prove that her coffee was showing up in your Starbucks coffee, right? Same example over and over and over again, right? So how do you solve this? So this is kind of where technology matters. So there's something called blockchain that we use. It's a technology that powers Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is one of thousands of applications. It's like the internet, right? Everybody uses the browsers. I think about blockchain as a browser. So here's what we did. We decided to build a blockchain platform focused on ending extreme poverty and enabling refugees, migrant workers, and folks who are displaced, giving them the ability to own their transaction identity, right? A lot of people think about identity as the holy grail. For me, identity, if it is combined with your history, combined with your education data, is much more valuable than you just walking around with an identity card, okay? So here's the big difference between traditional technologies and the technology that's called blockchain or distributed ledger technology. What distributed ledger technology is that when two parties or more participate in a transaction, both parties or all parties get a copy of that transaction. It's kind of an important piece to remember. You weren't expecting this at this conference, but I'm going to teach. This is key, right? Because this is it's going to affect every single business in the world. It's going to affect every NGO in the world. It's going to affect every government entity in the world. In the next 5 years, everybody's going to be on blockchain, like it or not, even universities, right? So in this example of Tony being a refugee, and I just taught him how to do, some vocational thing, right? If we had used blockchain to record that, Tony would get a permanent copy that he can access from anywhere in the world because the blockchain technology is distributed. I don't need anybody to be technically geeky about it. I'm just saying a very simple application is, which is what we do, is that that refugee at the end of the line now gets a secure copy of that transaction that nobody can ever steal, nobody can ever tamper with. So I'll give you a live example now. So what we're doing with the Somali refugees in Kenya. So if you're a Somali refugee in Kenya, and we've quite a few thousands of them now on the platform, every time an interaction happens with the refugee, they use our platform to record that transaction. So let's just go back to the simple example. Tony sits in a class with me and I teach him how to do HTML programming, right? At the end of the course, instead of me just doling out a piece of paper, I actually dole out an electronic receipt that basically has the certification of his education. And I put it on the chain and it's certified by the network. And Tony can access it from anywhere in the world using just a basic cell phone. That's the power of the technology, right? The application is massive because if you look at the very fundamental disruption that just occurred in the transaction where Tony was just handed a piece of paper to tell him, hey, you're a refugee and we taught you something. If he had to move from one place to another, he's at a disadvantage, right? Whereas if Tony now had a copy that was on the internet that cannot be tampered with, and he can access it based on biometrics, whatever, thumbprint, phone print, or whatever, right? He now can prove his existence in the world. Make sense? So we now are using this platform so that the refugees, when they go through training, when they go through certifications, when they're receiving aid, it starts building this history. We call it the economic passport. I'll give you another example, because examples are the only way I can explain it, right? Theory is useless. So in Costa Rica, we started a rollout with IDB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank, to solve the problem where these migrant workers do not get jobs. I think somebody brought that up, right, when we were talking. They do not get jobs because they are migrant workers. And what happens is the employers, right, the large employers, want to know if your backloaded certification is not fake, right? They want to know if it's legit. So what we've done is we use the blockchain technology. We've started a rollout with 1,000 vulnerable youth. So if I go through the education program as a migrant worker, and now I have been taught a certain skill set, that skill set certificate goes onto the chain and it's certified, and it's a one-time copy that gets sealed. So as a migrant worker, I am not having to walk around with a piece of paper in my pocket, right? And so when I start applying for jobs, the employers can log on to the network and say, hey, Ashish, he's a migrant worker. His education has been certified. Because the fundamentals of distributed ledger technology or blockchain is that it's not a database, it's not a single place, it's being certified by multiple players. It's a simple way to say it. If I said this is a piece of paper that has 4 letters on it, if each one of you certify it and each one of you has a copy of it, that's the way the technology works, then it's very hard for me to corrupt this record. It's very hard for me to change it, right? Because I'd have to go and wipe out every single one of you's copy, right? Think about the power of distributed versus centralized. In today's world, what happens? I have a university database, right? That can be hacked. But if I have a copy sitting on a network and each one of you has certified it, I'd have to hack into each one of your computers, change it, and then corrupt it, which becomes extremely hard as the network grows. So in this Costa Rica example, you can read about this, it's public. These kids now have the ability to show their certification, their education, they're migrant workers, and the employment community is able to look at it just once and know that their education has been certified. Somebody asked the question about collaboration between universities, right? This is perfect for, and Father Michael and I have had this conversation before, this is perfect for universities that are collaborating through refugee camps or different institutions, right? If you are teaching a refugee student something in one of your campuses, right? The power of technology allows that certification to be sealed and available globally. so that that refugee child or refugee student is not treated as a number, because that's what happens today, right? If you've ever been a refugee, I wasn't a refugee, I was a migrant worker, right? But for me, the legitimacy was that somebody let me open a bank account, and that got me out of poverty. But in today's world, if you're a refugee and you cannot prove your paper, like good example is the Myanmar crisis, right? Everybody's read about it, right? The Rohingya had to leave in the middle of the night because their houses were getting burned down. You think they were walking out with pieces of paper? No, they weren't, right? And when the Myanmar government says you can come back as long as you can prove, that makes no sense, right? So the value of technology or technologies like blockchain is that if your data is controlled and managed and owned by you, own, access, monetize, and permission, you suddenly have legitimacy, right? So in Costa Rica, what we're doing is now giving these migrant workers kind of the LinkedIn meets your biodata and it's certified, right? The ability to prove their existence. One more example, and then I can open up for questions. If you look at what we're doing in Syria, for example, in the Syria and the Jordan border, one of the interesting things that's happening is as the refugee crisis starts to go past 4 to 5 years, it stays there, right? You've probably seen this. We've seen this in Dadaab. They're coming up on 25 years or something like that, some crazy number of years. The camp's never going away. So what's happening now is that the Syrian refugees on the Jordan border, they're basically working. They're getting loans. They're getting predatory lending, right? So one of the things what we're doing is we're rolling out for 1,000 Syrian refugee mothers the ability to now use technology to prove their existence. So if they got a training program delivered to them so they know how to, for example, do basket weaving or whatever the vocation might be, that certificate becomes part of their identity. So if they are ever forced to move again, or if they do go back to Syria, none of their history is wiped out, right? It's a very fundamental flaw in the current model we live in, right? Which is, if you cannot prove your transaction data, you don't exist. I'll give you one more example that's not education related, but it's very relevant, right? So going back to the mother, so we started, and this is public again, we started a rollout with Anheuser-Busch, the beer company, in Zambia back in May, where extreme poverty farmers, they were living in extreme poverty and did not have the ability to get out of poverty, right? So we use this platform where now every time a mother sells her bag of cassava, which is juca, if you're from Latin America, she gets a secure message via SMS that becomes part of her identity. So she can now prove, I've been selling 40 kilos, 30 kilos of cassava, and she cannot be cheated because remember the multiple copy example, right? So fast forward today, in the last 8 or 10 weeks, we have about 2,000 farmers that have sold, and this is a key piece, you can look it up, 800 tons of cassava through the platform. And these farmers now have the ability to prove their records, right? If you see there's a documentary art, the mother basically says, my children can go to school now because I exist in this supply chain, right? So the last thing I'll say, right, is as you go into this next couple of days, the values are very high of education, right? But I would also make a case for if you can't prove your education, right, it doesn't matter, right? Because I had an Uber driver here last year in New York City. He's a doctor from Iraq. It broke my heart because he's like, I can't prove I'm a doctor from Iraq. I'm a refugee and I drive an Uber. And he was teared up because his education is worthless because it's not provable. Questions? Yes?
Does this require like common analysis of smartphones around so people connect?
So the question was, does this require high commonality of smartphones? Actually, no. We have about 30,000 households on our network, which is equivalent to about 150,000 people, of which I'd say 30 to 40% are refugees and migrant workers. The only thing you need is an SMS-enabled phone. So let's take a live example. So if I gave you an education, you sat in the classroom all day and I gave you an education, basically I can now SMS to you a code that legitimizes your degree. And that code, when you can punch it into a smartphone, you can punch it into a laptop at another university that accepts the network, they'll show you, what was your name? Gregory, it was educated here. So Gregory does not need anything more than an SMS phone. Yes, so the way Gregory proves he's Gregory. So the question was, how does Gregory prove he's Gregory? So first of all, Gregory doesn't need a smartphone. The first step happens is you register Gregory onto the platform, and the registration process happens, so we're for example, we're rolling out a project in Latin America to reduce child labor in the farming industry. So what we're doing in that case, you register the children once onto the platform, but the student does not need a smartphone. So you take a picture and the government ID, right? It depends based on the country, and you triangulate the picture, the geolocation, and the cell phone number of the student, and now it's on the network. So when Gregory comes and says, hey, I want to show you that I'm educated, with GRS, he gives us the cell phone and he gives the identity card, and his record shows up. So if his photo didn't match, then he was lying about it. So at we operate in very low fidelity areas where all you need in the last mile is an SMS phone. And you can integrate, so like one quick thing. So what we're doing in Costa Rica, we're actually integrating, for example, with the registry of the national school system. So that way, the children are not discriminated based on the fact that they could be coming from a certain slum area, because that's what's happened in Latin America, right? If you're from a certain slum, you won't get hired. So the way to decouple that is to bring in their registration, prove that they have the baccalaureate degree, but not have to worry about what slum they came from. Yes?
I just want to thank you for bringing the conversation about blockchain into this conversation. I think it's really important.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, and there's a lot of conversation on blockchain revolves around cryptocurrency. We don't touch cryptocurrency. I believe that, I don't know what's going to happen with cryptocurrencies or not. What I really try to talk about is the value of blockchain or more distributed ledger technology is to the benefit of the 2.5 billion people who live in extreme poverty or are refugees today. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I've got two quick questions.
Yes.
First is, what do you have in place to avoid misuse or corruption in the registration process? And the second question is, I was looking at your website as you were talking. If you could explain profit for purpose, I'm interested to hear what that is.
So the two questions was, one was profit for purpose and how do you avoid corruption. So let's get the corruption piece first. So the way the basics of blockchain work, right? That's independent of what we as a company do. The way the blockchain or distributed ledger technology works is that you have no centralized mechanism, right? So if you have a centralized mechanism, it's easy to corrupt. So here's a good example, right? If you've seen what's happened with banks in the US where, like in Wells Fargo, they open multiple bank accounts, but you didn't know about it, right? Because it's a centralized system that even if it wasn't hacked, whoever has access has control to it. In the distributed ledger technology, just take this room, right? There's 50 people in this room, right? And if we said that this piece of paper had 40 letters on it, unless all 50 of you guys said it was not these 40 letters, right? Then it has 40 letters on it, right? So each one of you is certifying independently without knowing the other 50, right? So from a corruption standpoint, unless I basically bribe all 50 of you, hold a gun to each one of your head, and make you change your record, it won't actually take your change because the rest of the network is not agreeing to it. So that's the way to avoid corruption. I'll give you another example, which is kind of more tangible example, and this is kind of one of the stuff we did in Zambia. If I'm a farmer, right, and I'm selling in today's world, say coffee to Gregory, and then Gregory sold it to a big coffee company, what happens in reality is that Gregory will pay.
In terms of birth registration and livelihoods and cash programming, where we're having this interaction where the beneficiary can own the data fundamentally changes the political relationship between the Western aid service providers and the beneficiaries.
So great question. It's actually controversial because we run into that a lot. So nobody has actually done that because it's contradictory to their model, right? Again, since we're having an honest conversation. So there are agencies that, there's a lot of public information that say, hey, we use blockchain to help the refugees. But if you look past the headline, they're using it for settlement. They're using it on the currency side, right? It's less to do with the refugees' empowerment, right? We have not found a for-profit or an NGO, for that matter, where they have given up the data czarship, right? Because if you are, and it's not just NGOs, they're just corporations, right? I mean, we made a conscious decision that we are not going to own data, right? We could have gone the other side and said, we can own this data and we'll be the next data czar, right? So it's the same issue that the NGOs have, which is if your model of foundation or funding, is tied to output and not outcome, right? Then it's actually contrary to your model to let the beneficiary own their data, right? Just being very honest here. Whereas if you said, hey, my model is tied to outcome, right? Health outcomes or education outcomes, then you're going to break your own business model. But I haven't seen that. Hope that answers your question.
Just as a remark, signing my students' academic records every semester, I'm thinking that it's completely ridiculous and doesn't make sense anymore in a digital world. But we are still doing that. But there are certainly regions in the world that need it digitalized more than, let's say, in Poland at the moment. Who would you recommend first to get the technology that you're using for empowering refugee education? Which institutions, which regions, where do you think it would be most usable at the moment?
I think, it's all baby steps, right? I mean, back in 2017, March of 2017, we started with one rollout with 300 farmers, right? We have over 20,000 farmers today, so start really small. To answer your question very specifically, I would say you want to start with a very small group of 1 or 2 universities that are very intently working on refugee education, right? And I'm going to use this silly example because a lot of people try to boil the ocean, right? And it never works then. So I use the example of the fax machine, right? Technologies like blockchain are based on network effects, right? And it's the fax machine analogy, which is the first fax machine was completely useless till the second came along, right? But you did not need more than 2 fax machines to communicate, right? So what we have found is that if you pick 1 or 2 universities at the most and say, hey, we have 500 refugees that are going to go through HTML programming certification, for example, and we're going to collaborate to certify their education on blockchain, you would have done so much more for the refugees' ability to own that certification than they going from 5 different aid agencies getting a piece of paper. That's, it's very, very small but very powerful because you're consciously saying you are not going to be looked at as a refugee anymore. You're a client, and as a client, you own your education certification, and that's how we look at our participants as clients, right? Right. The kid in Costa Rica is a client who now is empowered to prove he has a vocational certification, and when Cisco or Intel is going to hire him, they're going to look at them and say, this is a great kid I can hire because his education is certified. So that's how I do it. It's very small. Yes, sir.
From a practical standpoint in the different countries that you would operate in, could you talk briefly about the obstacles, the national enforcement obstacles that you might run into and how you're going to deal with it? For instance, in a lot of these countries where you have refugee crises, the governments themselves are loath to let anything come in that interferes with their ability to control information. So, and this is really very subversive to that in a positive way, I would argue. But how do you get over that?
So the question is, how do you get over obstacles, right? So we're live in 12 countries, and other than City of Austin, all of them, rest of them are pretty hard countries, right? So we're live Zambia, Uganda, starting Malawi next week, Indonesia, Jordan, Syrian border, Brazil. So I would say the way we've gotten around kind of the government or the NGO stigma is to basically identify an anchor who doesn't really have the burden of the government. So let's take a live example, right? So if you are a school system that's going into refugee camps and you're going to teach kids how to do advanced math, let's take a simple example, right? So when you go and do that, you can actually use technologies like ours to certify the education and enroll the children so they have now a digital copy of that, right? And a lot of these kids are very savvy, right? I mean, when I was in the Zatari camp, right, I met a young kid whose family was killed, and he was the guy who was actually running the Facebook group in the Zatari camp, right? So the way I would say, you could go down the standard path of the governments and blah, 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 or you can find an anchor education institution that is already teaching these kids and just use this technology to put their certifications on the blockchain, right? So that now these kids have a permanent record. And when they decide to migrate, they have that education certificate that they can show in an employment scenario and things like that. So what we've kind of figured out is, you can pick a fight and you'll spend 6 years trying to convince somebody in the government to do this, or you can just go to where the client is. And especially they're so resilient, right? I mean, I've learned so much from the mothers, I've learned so much from the refugees every day, right? They're resilient, right? They realize that their ability to exist is tied to if they can prove their existence, right? So that's how we've done it. We've run into barriers where we'll get a rogue middleman or a rogue local government guy who would push back. But the network effect is so powerful at the end user level that those barriers don't really seem to be big. Okay. Ready?
I have
Well,
questions, but-
Paulina's gonna kick me out.
No, that's fine. One last.
Obviously, a question of having having agencies which can take the paper certificates and convert them to that, but also that would raise questions on if they could, owning so much data, they could end up selling it for commercial reasons, because obviously there are people who would be interested in having information about, a lot of this information about people, which obviously could be exploited in many ways. So like, when I was traveling from along the refugee shelters in Mexico, there's an initiative of a Jesuit university in Puebla to have information because about the migrants passing through the shelters, because obviously some people disappeared along the way, and at least it was a way of tracking up to where in Mexico they had arrived. But first question I asked is, what if some of the criminal organizations get hack into your system? But obviously, blockchain helps deal with that. But obviously, there are the human interactions and the agencies which are working with this data. So obviously, those are things to continue to work out along the way. There's always the possibility of corruption at some point in the inputting of this, and also in what can be done with this data once it's gotten out of the database.
Yeah, and that's a good question, right? I mean, look, I think a lot of the hacks that have happened, they've all happened at the currency level. So if you look at any of the hacks that have happened in blockchain, right, they've happened at the cryptocurrency level. That's one of the reasons why we did not go down that path. We used the pure blockchain side. And the way we built it is because the data is owned by you, right? Unless I hold a gun to your head or take out, your fingerprint, there's just no way for me to get to your data, right? Now the question of the corruption, what we find, the current systems are so flawed, right? In Congo, I saw that the healthcare agencies maintain a register of the family name, the location, and it's on paper, right? And so what we found that the technology element actually makes it much more robust and secure if you're not using a database model, right? And that's the biggest risk that I always saw. And I personally, you find a lot of the aid workers or agencies are walking around with a laptop, and all the beneficiary information is on a spreadsheet, right? I mean, that's just crazy, right? And so what we found, it's not a perfect solution, right? Trust me. But based on the current scenarios, right, it's much safer in terms of, now, it doesn't mean it won't, you know, blockchain won't get hacked, but it hasn't yet, so. Are you kicking me out?
Are there any more questions?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much.